Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Geological Society of Oman would like to welcome you for the fourth webinar, where we share new topics about several geological and petroleum engineering aspects. As you know that in the midst of the pandemic with COVID-19 has hit all the globe, GSO adopt a distance learning program where we can share new technical elements through various webinars. This is the fourth webinar since the pandemic started. And we have the commitment and sustainability that we will support you and expand the discussion further. Today we have a different topic. It is very unique in terms of how the industry evolve and develop critical safety elements, where human is coming as a first before any other assets or any other profitable values. Bore pressure prediction, it is one of the key elements that has been involved in the industry since the beginning of it, almost 150 years ago. We will talk with an expert who has been well known for his unique work as a senior explorer, Mr. Mahmoud al-Shafi'i, and a geophysicist from Petroleum Development Oman. He is currently leading the North Oman Oil Exploration Execution Project. Mahmoud has 14 years in the industry and across the region with Royal Dutch Shell and BDO. His experience spans the exploration value chain and play as a focal point and a subject matter expert in the well planning and operation to hydrocarbon maturation. Mahmoud's specialist skills include bore pressure predictions, and he is now the PPP reviewer for the exploration wells in BDO. So Mahmoud, we welcome you. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation and giving the GSO members the opportunity to learn and listen to you. So the stage is yours, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Talal, for inviting me and having me today, and giving me the chance to speak to the society about a topic that is very close to my heart. I hope people find it useful. I'm not sure how many people are online, but I would like to welcome them all and thank them for joining us today. So today I have some presentation material to share with you. I will try to cover the presentation in 30 to 40 minutes so that we have enough time for questions. And I'm hoping there will be some interesting questions coming from all of you. I just want to highlight here, we're discussing a pretty complex and detailed topic, and we'll not be able to discuss, of course, all the details, but I will try to give you a bit of a flavor of what the topic is, just to create some curiosity and hopefully when you come across it in the industry, you're familiar with what it is about. Any other questions? Any people who are working in pore pressure prediction and have further questions, I'm happy to answer them either today or offline if you wish. I would share my email with you. So I will now share my presentation material. Please just let me know, Talal, when you see it.
Indeed, yeah. Yes, we see the presentation now.
Okay, great. So I'm now in presentation mode. So Dr. Talal introduced me very nicely. Thank you, Dr. Talal. So I'm currently an explorer in PDO. I have some experience in pore pressure prediction from Shell and PDO that I would like to share with you today. In my presentation today, I'll try to answer some of the basic questions, right? So what is pore pressure prediction? Why do we do it, and why do we need it? Who's responsible for it? So basically, who gets to participate in predicting the pore pressures? What are the sources of overpressures, and how do we predict them? And then I will try to touch on the pressure regimes in Oman. I will focus on Block 6, where I have experience. And then we will end up with some of the enemies of robust pore pressure prediction. So basically, why do we sometimes get it wrong, and we sometimes get it wrong in Oman and elsewhere, as you will see. So pore pressure prediction, this is basically the general definition. It is a safety critical element. It is a complex and multidisciplinary element of subsurface evaluation. So these are the three things I want you to remember. It is safety critical, and it is in the core of process safety, and it is an important contribution from us as subsurface professionals. It is rather complex because it is multidisciplinary, so it requires a bit of integration of different disciplines. It requires a good understanding of the subsurface and the geology. It requires a good understanding of the pressure generation mechanisms. So it is generally considered a complex evaluation, and it happens. We do it for all our wells. We do it for our exploration wells and our development wells. So any well that drills through to any target will have to have some form of pore pressure prediction work assigned to it. Okay, so the objective basically of any well that we drill is we want to drill to a target reservoir, and we want to do that both safely and efficiently, right? And pore pressure prediction helps us with both of these elements. So it helps us to drill the well without any issues or with less safety exposure, I would say, and then also effectively. So we want to drill our wells as cheap as possible. And as you know, that this is becoming a very critical element of our wells, especially in a low oil price environment where we're trying to optimize our wells. So pore pressure prediction helps with that. And in order to do that, we need to understand the geology. So we basically, as subsurface individuals, we are the owners of the subsurface. So we need to tell our engineers what do we expect to see in the subsurface. And part of that is telling them what are the pressures that they're going to encounter while they're drilling the well. So we've started talking about pore pressure prediction, but let's just give the definition first, right? The pore pressure is basically the pressure of the fluid in the pores in the rock. So we know that the rock below a certain level, a very shallow level, what we call the water table, all our the pores in the subsurface are filled in with some form of fluid. That fluid could either be water or brine, could be hydrocarbons, oil or gas. And pore pressure is about is basically the pressure held within that fluid in the pores in the subsurface. And just like any other fluid, the pore fluid exerts the pressure equally in all directions. That's one property of fluid pressure. So it exerts it both on the sediments and also on the grains and on the cement in the rock. It's important to remember that if we generally fluids like to travel from where they are at high pressure to where there is low pressure. So if we're drilling through with a well, and while we're drilling that well, we do not the pressure in the well is less than the pressure in the formation. Basically, the fluid of the formation will try to go from the formation into the well. And this is exactly what we try to avoid by predicting the pressures. So in very basic terms, we want to be drilling the well with pressures, with what we call mud pressures, that is higher than the pore pressures, just to keep the fluid into the reservoir while we're drilling. When we start producing the well, we want that fluid to go from the reservoir into the borehole or into the tubing. But while we're drilling, we want to make sure that that fluid stays in the reservoir. So that's why we need to predict the pressures to ensure that we are drilling the wells with sufficient pressures that are either equal or higher to the pore pressures. Let's start off with some basic definitions. So we defined what pore pressure is, but there will be other definitions or other terms that you will come across when you start looking into pore pressures. So let's start off with pressure first, just maybe for those who are less familiar with the term. Pressure in very basic terms, it is the force per unit area. So let's imagine that you have, and pressure, we get it everywhere. So we can, let's imagine that someone is standing on a floor. That person has a certain weight, right? And the weight that you exert on the floor is basically the mass of the person and the gravity effect of that mass exerted on a certain area, which is the area, for example, of your foot, right? And the higher the mass of the person, the higher the weight, the higher the force, so the higher the pressure exerted. Also, the smaller the area, the higher the pressure. So remember that force and pressure go together, and area and pressure go against each other. So the smaller the area, the higher the pressure. Formation pressure, we explained that. Gauge pressure is actually a measurement of pressure that we get in the subsurface. So for those of you who have drilled wells, you know that when we sometimes drill a well, we would enter a certain formation and we want to understand what the pressure of the fluid in that formation is. So we run tools. Those tools could either be XPT tools, MDT tools, RFT tools, and then we actually measure the actual pressure. So that is what we call the gauge pressure, and it is a hard measurement of the pressure data. And later on, we'll see how that is important. Then there is the hydrostatic pressure, and hydrostatic pressure is basically the pressure of water, a water column, from surface or from the water table down to any point in the subsurface. And it is you see it here on the plot. So let me just now move to the plot that you see on the right, and in the plot you see that we have pressure on the x-axis and depth on the y-axis, and you have a number of curves that we show here. One of them is the hydrostatic, and the hydrostatic is usually the lower bound of pore pressures. So pore pressures in normal circumstances are either at hydrostatic or above hydrostatic in what we call overpressure. If it is hydrostatic, we say that this is normally pressured regime. And the reason we have a normally pressured regime is that we have a connected fluid all the way from water table down to any point in the subsurface. Okay. Lithostatic, on the other hand, is the weight exerted by a column of rock and fluids at any point in the subsurface. So let's just imagine you're at a certain depth in the subsurface, and you have above you a column of rock that is exerting a certain pressure. This is what we call the lithostatic or overburden, and you would see it here in the curve is green, and it is usually the upper bound of the pore pressure. So pore pressures cannot be higher than the lithostatic pressure, and generally cannot be lower than hydrostatic pressure, except if we have depletion. And depletion happens in fields that are under production. So I'm talking here in normal circumstances, pore pressure will always sit between the green line and the black line. Overpressure is any pressure that is higher than the hydrostatic. Okay, so when we later discuss overpressure, just remember it is an abnormal pressure, and the overpressure value is just the difference between the pore pressure and the hydrostatic pressure. The last curve we have here is the fracture pressure, and fracture pressure is shown here in orange, and this is basically the pressure at which we start fracking a formation, right? So this is also very important for well design, and we'll explain why. But just bear in mind that this is another important curve that you will see on a lot of the pore pressure charts. The very last term that I want to share with you here is vertical effective stress. This is a slightly more complex term, but let's just try to explain it briefly, because it will we will come to it in one of the other slides. So let's just imagine that you are at a certain point in the subsurface, and there is a force exerted on that particular point by what we have described as the overburden pressure. So there is a mass of rock above you that is pushing downwards, right, due to gravity. But that point in the subsurface is in equilibrium, right? It's not moving in normal circumstances. It's not moving. So there has to be another force acting in the opposite direction, right? If there is a force acting in one direction, and it either does one of two things. It either moves what is it acting on, or there is another force in the opposite direction keeping it in equilibrium. So if we have an overburden acting downwards, then in the opposite direction you have two other forces acting upwards. One of them is the force exerted by the matrix of the rock itself, or what we call the vertical effective stress. So the rock itself has a certain strength that exerts a force that is opposite to that overburden pressure. The other part is the pore pressure itself. So the fluids themselves, they act, as we said, they act in all direction, and one of those direction is upwards, just in the opposite to the direction of overburden pressure. So acting downwards is the overburden pressure, acting upwards is the vertical effective stress and the pore pressure itself. So pore pressure and vertical effective stress, they always have to equal the overburden pressure. I hope I did not confuse you with that term, but we will explain it in a bit more detail in a later slide. Again, very quickly, why is it important? It is important for safe execution of the well and for reducing the costs. We already discussed that. So we want to avoid unwanted events, and we explained that if the pore pressure, if the mud pressure is less than the pore pressure, what will happen is that the fluid will escape from the pores into the borehole, and they will go upwards, right? And if we have a BOP, then we can close the BOP. But if we don't have the BOP, or if we cannot close the BOP on time, we can end up with a similar situation like the one shown here, where you have a blowout or an escape of fluid to surface. The other thing is about optimizing the casing and the mud design. So while we drill the well, we drill into different pressure regimes. And what the well engineers would do is that when we provide those pore pressures, they would take them and they would use them to design the well. So they would say, for example, to drill this well, we need 3 casing designs, because we are going through 3 different, for example, pressure regimes that we need to isolate. So we drill one pressure regime, we set a casing, we isolate it, we drill the second, we isolate it, then we drill the third. We cannot drill everything at the same time, because if we do that, we cannot control all of these pressure regimes together. So it's about optimizing the casing design and optimizing the mud program as well. So the well engineers as well, they would think, okay, we want to make sure that we drill with a mud weight that is equal or higher than the pore pressures. It's also important about ranking prospects for drilling. So a prospect, for example, which has higher pressure means that we need a more complex well, means that it is a more expensive well to drill. So we want to predict the pressures correctly so that we're able to rank those prospects for drilling. The last one is applying the appropriate barriers, right? So in the industry, we drill overpressured wells all the time. Some of them are mildly overpressured, but some of them are severely overpressured. Like, for example, the wells that we drill in PDO targeting the Ara formation. This is a very overpressured formation, but we drill it all the time because it has prospects and it has hydrocarbons that we want to produce. But we do that by applying the appropriate barriers. So by predicting pressures correctly, we apply the appropriate barriers. Okay? So safe execution and reducing the costs. This is another explanation of what I just had. So all we have talked about is on the well engineering side. So it's about decreasing the risks and costs as explained. It's about optimizing the rig selection. So for those of you who are familiar with rig selection, you would start hearing about 3K rigs, 5K rigs, 10K rigs, 15K rigs. What those types of rigs are is basically the specs of the rig and what pressure can be handled by those different rigs. So in other words, when we predict the pressures, we tell the well engineers that, for example, this particular prospect requires a 10K rig or requires a 5K rig. That's sufficient. So that's optimizing the rig selection. Next is designing the most efficient mud program and casing program. We discussed that. Preventing some of the undesirable events like lost wells, kicks and blowouts, some well bore stability problems, some stuck pipe. We also do not want to be drilling the wells with mud weight that is too high, because if we do that, we can end up with stuck pipe. We don't want to do formation damage. That also could happen if your mud weight or mud pressure is much higher than the formation pressure. You end up with invasion and you damage your formation. some events are called casing and burst events, casing collapse and burst events. You can avoid those as well by doing the right pore pressure protection. So a lot of undesirable events that you hear about while drilling wells can be avoided by having the right pore pressure protection. I just want to touch upon other reasons why we do pore pressure protection, less common reasons, and it's related to exploration prospectivity. And this is more about understanding your trap integrity and hydrocarbon retention, understanding your aquifer continuity, and understanding your pressure cells. So if you drill in one place and have a certain pressure, and you drill another place and you have a different pressure, that tells you something about the geology, about the continuity of the geology. It's about understanding the fluid and rock types for QI work, understanding the quality prediction. So certain rocks will have different pressure regimes due to reservoir quality. So by predicting the pressures, you predict the reservoir quality. It's about understanding the source rock maturity. So in the unconventional word, pressures tell us how mature the rock is. So the more mature the rock, the higher the pressures within that rock. It's about understanding your your petroleum systems and your PVT properties. So some of these are a bit unusual or uncommon reasons why we do pore pressure prediction. But just I want you to bear them in mind, and they're mostly related to exploration prospectivity. So what happens if we get it wrong? Catastrophes could happen if we get it wrong. I here show two pictures. One of them is from the Central North Sea in 1991. And the other one is from the Nile Delta, closer to my home in 2006. As Dr. Talal was saying, we have been doing pore pressure prediction forever, but those types of incidents were more common in the past. Alhamdulillah, we have been doing a better job, and therefore there are less of these issues or these catastrophes in the industry now, because we have been doing a better job in doing a pore pressure prediction. So just bear those in mind, and of course you can know when these catastrophes happen, what they could mean for companies, right? So for example, a company like companies, for example, where the BP and Macondo, the catastrophe had huge impact on BP and on the industry altogether. So these incidents could have a huge impact on the industry. Next question is, who does it? And we split it here into two parts: pre-drill assessment of pore pressure prediction and real-time prediction. So pre-drill is what we do before we drill the well. Real-time prediction is what we do while we're drilling the well. And you see in the top here, there are different methodologies that we use in pore pressure prediction: basin modeling, velocity-based analysis, what we call a pressure cell analysis, offset calibration. And while we're drilling, we do this with real-time monitoring and model building. And below that, you see the different disciplines involved in pore pressure prediction. So you see that the geologist is involved, a geophysicist is involved, the reservoir engineer and petrophysicist is involved, and the drilling engineer is involved. So that's why it is a multidisciplinary subject. And depending on the type of modeling that you do, some of the disciplines become more important than others. So if, for example, if you're drilling in greenfield exploration, you don't have any well calibration, basin modeling, for example, becomes very important. And this is where the geologist plays a more important role. If, for example, if you're drilling in an offshore setting, for example, a delta, velocity-based analysis is very important, and this is where the geophysicist does a bit more work. If you're doing an offset calibration and you have a lot of well calibration in your area, like, for example, in PDO, the reservoir engineer and the petrophysicist play a very critical role as well. The drilling engineers, they play a critical role throughout because they're the customer of pore pressure prediction. So for us as subsurface individuals, we provide the pore pressure prediction to the drilling engineers. Again, this is another explanation. So depends on where you are on the spectrum. If you have many basin wells, to several basin wells, to many area wells, to sparse regional data, or to wildcat, the pore pressure itself, the methodology changes, right? So I will not get into too much detail about the methodologies, but I just want you to bear in mind that basin modeling can be an important methodology, velocity-based, geological models, pressure cells, reservoir models. These are all things that we can use to predict the pressures. Of course, the uncertainty increases when you don't have a calibration data. So if you have a lot of basin wells, your uncertainty is much lower than when you're, for example, drilling in a totally uncalibrated area. Okay. So where is it? Where is overpressure found? So if we are in a normally pressured regime, generally everyone is happy. We as subsurface individuals, we are happy. We feel that we have safe subsurface to drill in. The well engineers are happy. They have simpler wells. The problem becomes is when you're drilling in an overpressured regime. So where does overpressure happen? It happens worldwide. It happens everywhere. So it happens in old basins, it happens in new basins, it happens in different depositional environments. So I give here an example. It happens in the Niger Delta, for example, which is a deltaic environment in a passive margin, just like the Nile Delta. It happens in the Gulf of Mexico. It happens in older basins, like the third basin in Libya, which is a marine rift basin. It happens in some of the older basins, like the in Oman here. So we see the overpressures in Precambrian rocks, in the Paleozoic and in the Paleozoic rocks. So it could happen everywhere, right? And we see it in North Oman, we see it in South Oman, we see it in salt in South Oman, we see it in clastics in North Oman, as we'll explain later in the slide. So just bear that in mind, right? And this map here shows where all the overpressures could be or have been observed in the worldwide. So what are the sources of overpressure? And this is to me as an important element. You need to understand what the sources of overpressures are to be able to predict it. And I've subdivided here these sources of overpressures into three groups: loading related phenomena, volume change phenomena, and fluid movement or buoyancy related phenomena. And we'll not be able to discuss all of them in details, but we will explain three of the sources of overpressures, basically the three most important sources of overpressure. But let me just give you a bit of an analogy, or a bit of something just to help you understand this. Just like imagine that you have a bottle of Coke, a plastic bottle of Coke, and that bottle of Coke has fluid inside, right? One way to create pressure in that bottle of Coke would be to apply pressure to that bottle of Coke. So basically to squeeze that bottle, okay? But the pressure will only happen if the bottle is closed at the top, right? And this is what we call stress-related or stress-generated pressure. You have a certain stress exerted on the rock, and at the same time, you're not allowing the fluids to escape. So this is stress-generated. The second one is if you have a volume change. So basically, you are trying to fit in more Coke into the bottle. And again, the bottle has to be closed, but you're trying to fit in more fluid into the bottle by, for example, injecting more fluid into the bottle, right? And that's related to volume change. The other one is related to fluid movement or buoyancy effects. So just imagine that same bottle of Coke, you started shaking it. So what happens is that you liberate the gas, and when you liberate the gas try to escape, and if that same bottle is closed, that creates pressure into the bottle. So in all of these situations, the bottle itself is closed, right? So that means you are in a bit of a closed system, and you're not allowing the pressures into the bottle to escape or to equilibrate. And this is a very, very important thing that I will come to explain in the next slide. Overpressure is generally a state of disequilibrium. As we said, fluids like to go from areas of overpressure to areas of lower pressure. So if we have a source of overpressure, then it will only be maintained if we do not allow the fluid pressure to escape. So that's why we call this as a state of disequilibrium. And overpressure is generally it's a dynamic and not a static state. So you have to think when you think about pressures, think about time and think about geology. So geology helps us understand the sources of overpressure. Time helps us understand whether that overpressure will be maintained in the rock or will dissipate, right? So there is a pressure generation mechanism, one of these mechanisms that we explained. There is a pressure transfer mechanism. Sometimes pressure will be exerted in one place, and we'll explain that, but it gets transferred to another place. So understand also your pressure transfer mechanisms. Could be a fault, could be a carrier bed. and there is a pressure dissipation mechanism. So if that overpressure is generated in the rock, will it be maintained in the rock or will it dissipate by being connected to other rocks, and therefore when we drill, we'll not feel it. So let's start off with the first source of overpressure, which is disequilibrium compaction. And it is by far the most common source of overpressure, and it is a very important one. And in very simple terms, it means that you have a piece of rock that is being buried deeper and deeper into the subsurface. And while it's getting buried deeper, it's not allowed to the fluids in it are not allowed to escape out of the pores. So just imagine that you have a sponge filled with water, and that sponge is being buried deeper and deeper into the subsurface. The normal reaction of that sponge when it gets buried deeper is that it will start squeezing and the fluids will escape, right? That's in the normal circumstances. But in disequilibrium compaction, that particular sponge is isolated from the rest of the subsurface. So just imagine that particular sponge is being buried into salt, for example. And I say salt because that's an important source of overpressure in Oman. So it's buried in salt, and therefore it's buried deeper. And that fluid tries to escape, but salt is a perfect seal, so it's not allowed to escape. That fluid in the sponge will basically be maintained, and therefore, when that happens, we start seeing an overpressure effect. So this is most common in basins where the rate of sediments is much higher than the rock is allowed to equilibrate. So it happens in deltas where you get kilometers of sediment depositing very, very quickly, and these are mostly shale sediments. And at the same time, you're not allowing that rock to equilibrate. But it also happens, as I said, it happens in Oman, in the Ara, where you're depositing the rock maybe slowly, but you're depositing it in the perfect seal. Okay, so I will try to explain a bit what I just explained. So this is a porosity depth plot, and in general circumstances, we have what we call a compaction trend. The deeper you are in the subsurface, the more compaction you have, the lower the porosity. But if you reach a certain point in the subsurface where the rock is not allowed to equilibrate, what happens is that the porosity, or the pores within that sponge that we just explained, will be maintained. So the porosity itself will be maintained and will stay high. Okay, so or will stay the same. So you see here that the porosity does not change with depth. On the other hand, let's explain this in another domain. Let's explain this in a vertical effective stress domain. So just imagine that your vertical effective stress in that same rock, on that same sponge, is basically the stress or the stress exerted by the sponge itself, the matrix of the sponge or the rock. If the rock is not allowed to compact, that vertical effective stress will be the same, because the more compaction you have, the more the grain to grain interface or pressure, the higher the vertical effective stress. But if we're not allowing the rock to compact, then the vertical effective stress will stay the same, right? Okay, let's now go to the same plot that we had in the beginning, and we said that the vertical effective stress is the distance between your pore pressure and the lithostatic pressure. So if you reach a certain point in the subsurface where the vertical effective stress is maintained, what happens is that you start creating your overpressure. So your rock start feeling pressure that are higher than the hydrostatic pressure. I'm conscious of time. I think I'm running a bit late, so I'll start running a bit faster. Dr. Talal, if you feel that I'm running over time, please let me know.
Indeed, you have 10 minutes, and then we will open the stage for the question. We have around 6 questions and more than 80 people attending the lecture.
That's good. Okay, so I'll go faster now. So this is exactly what we explained. A piece of rock A, being buried into the subsurface. It's burying deeper and deeper, but it's not allowed to compact. So we're seeing more overpressures building as we go deeper. And this is what we call compaction disequilibrium. And this is one source of overpressure. The next source of overpressure is a common one. It's again hydrocarbon generation. And the reason this happens is that you have source rock or kerogen that's being buried deeper into the subsurface, and that kerogen starts generating hydrocarbons. The hydrocarbons that are being generated, they have volumes that are bigger than the volumes of the kerogen itself. So you see here, this is the volume of the kerogen, the immature kerogen. The higher the vitrinite reflectance, the larger the volume of the fluid, and therefore you're trying to fit in more fluid into the same volume of rock. When this happens in the source rock, it starts generating overpressures, and you are common with the effect of when this happens is you start cracking your source rock, and you start liberating some of the hydrocarbons, which is a very important mechanism, and that hydrocarbon escapes the source rock and goes to the reservoir where we can find it and charges the reservoir. But until that happens, until we start cracking the hydrocarbons, the source rocks, and liberating the hydrocarbons, the source rock itself will have some overpressures related to kerogen maturation. So again, it's what we call a pressure cooker effect. We're trying to fit in more fluid into the same size of rock, and when this happens, you start creating overpressures. This overpressure you can feel in the source rock itself, so while you're drilling the source rock, or you can also feel it in an isolated reservoir that is connected to the source rock. So if you have a fault, for example, running from the source rock to a lens of sand above you or below you, you will start feeling the pressures of the source rock in that particular sand. You can also feel it in the actual fault itself. If you penetrate a fault close to the source rock, you can start feeling that overpressure. So it is you have to be very careful when you're drilling through mature source rock for sources of overpressure. The last one I want to explain is hydrocarbon buoyancy, and that is the effect that we explained earlier. It's about, for example, shaking a bottle of Coke and liberating the gas. The gas itself has an effect. It's lighter than the Coke itself. So what it does is it tries to escape. Right? It's lighter. Lighter fluids try to escape, but when it escapes, if that lid on the bottle is there, it tries to escape, and it finds the lid, so it starts to exert pressure. This is exactly what we have in a hydrocarbon system, where you have a seal, and you have hydrocarbon being generated into the rock, and therefore you start generating oil. Oil is lighter than water. It floats on top of the water, so it starts to exert pressure on the seal. Gas is even lighter, so it starts to exert even more pressure on the seal. And if we have a good seal, then that seal can basically withhold that pressure, and we start seeing some overpressures when we penetrate that seal. But this is a good type of overpressure, because it means that some hydrocarbons have been trapped into a formation. So the lighter the fluid, the more the overpressure that you have related to hydrocarbon buoyancy. The longer the column, also the higher the overpressure. So this is the third type of overpressure that I want to discuss. I then want to move to how is it measured. So how do we actually measure? So we do a certain prediction, and then we drill the well, and we want to measure the pressures. We want to make sure that we have predicted or measured the pressures correctly. So we have some form of what we call direct measurement. So we actually go down and measure with the RFT, NDT, so forth. There are also tools of measuring the overpressure while drilling, like we have the geotap here. While we're testing the well, we understand exactly what the pressures in the reservoir is. So these are all direct measurements. There is also some indirect measurements, like for example the mud weight. If you are drilling a certain reservoir with a certain mud weight, and you have not seen any flow from the reservoir to the borehole, then you know that the mud pressure is higher than the fluid pressure. So you can say that the fluid pressure must be lower than the mud weight. So that's a bit of an indirect measurement. Gas could be also an important measure. If you start seeing gas on your mud log, that means that you are maybe drilling close to your fluid pressure. So maybe you're not seeing a lot of flow, but you're seeing some gas being liberated. Actual log response. So you start seeing some changes on your logs that could be related to overpressures. Some changes in your drilling parameters. For example, the torque and the drag. So some of these will be used by the drilling engineers to say, okay, looks like we're getting into an overpressured zone. The seismic itself could be an indirect measurement, right? And maybe not on Oman, because we have a very old basin, but for example, in deltas, you can start seeing some inversions on your velocities that could be related to overpressures. The confidence itself, if you have a very hard measurement, then this is a very high confidence. A well test is also high confidence.
kicks, if you start getting kicks, also when you get a kick, we back calculate the pressures related to the fluid pressure. So it's a bit of an indirect measurement, but a high confidence indirect measurement. And then you go down the list. Mud weight becomes less reliable. Torque and drag, or what we call drilling parameters, these are even less reliable. So these are the prediction tools, and we said there are predictive tools. So tools that you use to predict the pressures before drilling the well. Then there are detection tools. While you're drilling the well, you can detect the pressures. And then there are confirmation tools. Basically, after you drill the well, you want to confirm, have you predicted your pressures correctly or not? And it is important to integrate all the inputs that you have. So integrating the pressure, the hard pressure data from nearby wells, understanding what the kicks data information is, understanding the mud pressure data from other wells, understanding the drilling parameters that were used to drill nearby wells. While drilling the well itself, keep an eye on some of the important parameters, like the drilling parameters. Gives you a feel of whether you have predicted it correctly, or do you need to update your prediction. So these are all things to bear in mind. So integration of all data is very important. Okay, so what are the key uncertainties? I think this is one more slide after this. The key uncertainty is the depth uncertainty of the tops. So if you predict first, for example, a certain overpressure in a formation, say I'm saying I'm drilling into salt, and I'm saying as soon as I drill the salt, there is a chance of overpressure. But that top salt itself could come in shallower or deeper. So make sure that you have a good uncertainty on your tops when you predict the overpressure. Usually we take the shallowest tops for our high pressure prediction and our deepest tops for the low pressure prediction. So this is maybe a good point to mention, that we never provide a single pressure prediction. We provide a pressure range, basically different scenarios. And we say that we expect the pressure to be sitting somewhere between that range, and that uncertainty is important. And part of that uncertainty, you capture that you capture the depth uncertainty of your prognosed tops. Also, the RFT and MDT measurements, we said that they're hard data, but they sometimes come with uncertainties. So always consult your petrophysicist. Am I looking at correct data, or there is uncertainty and error in that data? For example, supercharging that could give you higher pressure than what you're actually the actual reservoir pressure is. Also, does the fluid gradient agree with the PVT or salinity data? Do we have the right understanding of the fluids in the rock? Is that consistent with our understanding of the salinity data? More saline water has a higher density, which means it exerts more pressure. Are we looking at the same pressure cells? You have a pressure measurements from one part of the basin. Is it right to take that pressure measurements and apply to that different location at the same formation? Or is that, for example, a major fault running in between that separates these two? So it's important to understand the geological scenarios that you have in generation, transfer, and dissipation of the pressures. The last thing I want to measure, and I did not talk about that in detail, is the production effect. So for those of you who are working in production environments, it is very important to understand production effects, depletion and injection effects. And this is where the reservoir engineer plays a very critical role. If you're drilling into fields or if you're drilling below fields, it is very important that you understand, because production, it disturbs the whole pressure regime. So you have to understand what the depletion and injection effects are. The pressure regimes in Oman, I've talked about that. We generally see overpressures, a lot of overpressures in the salt, in the Ara. But we also see overpressures, for example, in North Oman in Block 6, in the Haima section. And we see it in the Mukrat and Barak and Amina. And it is related to isolated sand bodies that are not in communication with the rest of the rock, and therefore they have the ability of maintaining or preserving overpressures. And we see that we see that mild to some significant overpressures in Haima section, right? So so that's very briefly. Maybe if you have questions on that, I'll be happy to answer them as well. Okay, last slide. What are the enemies of overpressures, of poor pressure prediction? So we've tried to learn from our mistakes in the past. So where have we got it wrong? There are 6 reasons where or when we looked at all the incidents of poor pressure prediction, we saw 6 reasons. First of all, a false sense of security from the PPFG models. So we give the models, and we give a models that are not wide enough. We feel that we're a bit too confident. We have a good understanding of this basin. We know exactly what we're going to find, so we give a narrow model. uncertainty range. So this gives the well engineers a false sense of security, and then all of a sudden we enter into a particular geological scenario that is not considered. So the next one is geological scenario that is not considered. These two are pretty much related. Overconfidence as well. If you feel that, yeah, I know it all, we have drilled hundreds of wells, we know exactly what we're going to find, then you have to start worrying, because overconfidence is an enemy of pore pressure prediction. Always look at all your data. Competing commercial drivers, that's an important one, and it is becoming even more important now. You know, you'd have a well engineer coming and say, you know, are you sure about this overpressure? You know, it means that we need an additional casing, and it means that we're going to increase the well cost by another $500,000. So, you know, you feel you're under pressure, you really want to drill the well, but you know, you cannot really eliminate that particular overpressure scenario. So you say, okay, I'm going to remove that overpressure scenario, even though you have a very good geological reason to include it, and therefore that could be a reason of incidents. So make sure that when you do your pore pressure prediction, you do a proper technical piece of work, and you do not get competed by commercial drivers. Poor relationship and communications, we said it is a very integrated piece of work. So make sure that everyone communicates. Your well engineer, your petrophysicist, your reservoir engineer, your geologist, your geophysicist, you are all working on this together, and you communicate. The last thing is changes that are made without review process. So you have a very good pore pressure prediction range. Fine, everything looks good. But then, for example, the geologist comes in and changes the tops for a very good valid reason, but that does not get reflected on the pore pressures. So you end up with changes that are not being reflected on the pore pressure prediction. So when you feel that you're in any of these spaces, feel worried, because that could result in an undesirable situation. And as a person who does pore pressure prediction, you do not want to be the person who has done the prediction for a well where we have a huge incident. It poses a lot of risk on the people on the rig, and on the reputation of countries, and on the assets as well. So do it right. Always defend your prediction with good technical work. And yeah, that's it. I think this is all. The closing message. It's a complex and multidisciplinary. It requires integration. There is lots of issues related to pore pressures. So data issues are common. Time is usually short, but stakes are very high. So if we get it right, we're in good shape. If we get it wrong, we're in big trouble. And there is no cookie cutter approach. So I've discussed a number of approaches, but one approach that could be fit for purpose in one place, and it does not work in another place. So make sure that you have an approach that is best tailored for your particular technical issue, and I think that's it. So that will help us deliver safe wells as subsurface individuals. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much, Mahmoud. It's really a very interesting topics, and also it demonstrates like how the industry has been all the time, like learning from mistakes, like as you mentioned, the previous accidents that happens, and adopting new best practices, best standards, new regulations in accessing like some of the new basins with overpressures. We receive like various type of questions, and I see like a geologist, I see data scientists asking questions. I see also people from health and safety teams. So first questions was sent to us, Mahmoud, from Maria Salmi. The question is overpressure rock considered higher risk compared to the depleted rocks? What is your comment regarding pore pressure prediction in the depletion zones?
Yeah, so when you drill through a depleted zone, you want to make sure that you drill with a pressure that is not too high, because if you drill through a depleted zone with a mud pressure that is too high, a number of problems could happen. We explained one of them. You could have what we call a stuck pipe. So basically, your pipe gets stuck to the formation because of too much overbalance. That is one scenario. There is another scenario where you destroy your reservoir, or you frack your reservoir. So the higher the depletion, the weaker the rock, and it means that if you drill that particular rock with too high mud pressure, then you can frack the rock or break it. So they're both critical. We need to make sure that we are not drilling with mud weights that are too high or too low. If it's too low, you have flow. If it's too high, then there is the risk of destroying or breaking your formation, or ending up with other types of drilling problems like stuck pipe. I personally think that overpressures that are not predicted are more of an issue than depleted reservoirs. The thing is, usually you can have a lot of operational issues if you drill in depleted reservoirs, but it never causes a blowout, for example. Blowout happens when you have an overpressure, but they're both very important. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mahmoud. There's another question from Hamad Al-Durai. So Hamad is asking, okay, since you have lots of data has been collected about the bore pressure predictions from different geological settings, different geological basins, with the uncertainties that you mentioned in the slide about the salinity, the tops, and all that variable, is there any way or thought or perspectives in how can we utilize machine learning in predicting the bore pressure? Is there any trend in that direction?
Yeah. No, this is a very good question. I personally I'm not an expert in machine learning. I've read about it. But I think it's because we're talking here about dealing with a lot of data and being able to integrate a lot of information from a lot of data. We can do that ourselves, but with machine learning we can do that much more efficiently, right? So I think there is room definitely for applying machine learning here. By trying to analyze a lot of the data that we have from different basins, and also from our specific basin. So, for example, I'm talking about PDO. We have thousands and thousands of wells with a lot of pressure data. So, in order to understand all of this pressure data, it either requires a very, very good and talented reservoir engineer or petrophysicist or geologist to sit down and analyze the data. But if the machine can do some of this for us and help us predict the pressure, then that would be good as well. I think there will always the professional himself will always play a role, because the machine will only predict what we have seen before. It cannot predict a scenario that we haven't seen before, or at least that's the way I understand it. So the geological understanding is always important, but if you have a machine that helps you create models from a lot of data and helps you analyze a lot of data, that will be very, very important and very useful as well.
Indeed. So Hamad, Durai, so since you asked the questions, get in touch with the GSO, and we can get you the link to the teams where you can see some of the database where you can implement your data science skills. There's a question from Dr. Abdullah Ambouri. So Abdullah, he said, great talk. What is the cause of the overpressure in the Haima formation?
So we have discussed the Haima. Again, I'm not a Haima expert. But from what I've seen, Haima could have isolated sand bodies, and within deposited within shale units, or less permeable units, and that's depositing those units fast enough means that you can preserve overpressures in some of the sand bodies. So, for example, the Barrick, I'll just give that example. We have had examples where we have drilled through the Barrick and we have seen some anomalous overpressures. And we think that this has occurred in isolated sand bodies in the Barrick that are more or less encapsulated with shales. And those shales have meant that we can preserve those overpressures within that sand body. So it is just about the rate of deposition and the types of sediments that we're depositing, sands within less permeable shale formations.
Thank you, Mahmoud. So Abdullah Ambouri, so our message from GSO, be ready that we will host you for a session, inshallah, in the coming days, where we discuss about the overpressure in Barrick and Miqrat. So the questions from Aisha in Twitter. We are switching to different social platform now in Twitter. So there are lots of questions. Aisha, she's asking, can bore pressures depend on the rock diagnosis process?
Yes. Yeah. So actually, there is one of the sources of overpressure that we haven't talked about. is related very much to diagenesis, which is called elliptization. But that happens. We don't see that in I don't think we see it here in Oman, but it is common, for example, in deltas, where you have smectite to elite transformation, and that liberates some fluids that results in overpressures. Also, if there is a diagenesis process that somehow impacts the pore space, anything that impacts the pore space and exerts certain stress on the pore space, on the fluid in the pore space, can also result in that overpressure, assuming that, again, the rock. So the assumption that we always keep is that the rock is isolated. Diagenesis, as I said, there is a certain, if you look at the list, there is one source of overpressure is related very clearly to diagenesis, but I can see it also playing a role in other situations.
Thank you, Mahmoud. There's another more 3 questions. The question was saying, is the gamma ray logging good to predict the pore pressure?
Gamma ray itself does not predict the pore pressures. Gamma ray is a lithology indication, so it helps us understand what lithologies we have while we're drilling, and whether it helps us also correlate our geology. So if we're doing real-time prediction and we have gamma ray, then we can also say that, okay, we're coming on prognosis, we're coming shallower than prognosis. Just be careful. The overpressures that we said we're going to see at that particular depth, we may now see it shallower. But actually, the logs that are very important for pore pressure prediction is the density log, the sonic log, and the resistivity log. And the reason these are important, and again, not in Oman, but in, for example, deltas, is that these logs are we can relate them to porosity. So if we see porosities at a certain depth that are higher than the porosities suggested by the compaction curve, then that could be an indication of overpressures. So if you start seeing densities that are lower than the densities that you expect at a certain depth, or sonics that are lower, or resistivities that are different, then all of them we can be related to porosities, and therefore you can use them to predict the pressures. That's exactly the reason why we can use seismic velocities in prediction. Seismic velocities can predict if you see velocity regressions, or you see velocities that are lower than what you really expect by the compaction trend. The higher the compaction, the higher the velocities. So if you start seeing velocity regressions or lower velocities than what you expect, then that basically means that you are seeing rock that is not compacted as expected, and therefore it could mean that there is overpressure.
Indeed, and that's my answer. One of the questions about can we predict the pore pressure from modeling of the seismic inversion?
So only if, so for example, I'll talk about Oman. Oman, the problem is you have a very, very complex subsurface, and the velocities that you have in subsurface vary differently, very much from shale velocities to sand velocities to carbonates to anhydrites to salt, which means that the imprint of the lithology is much larger than the imprint of pore pressure. It only works if you have, for example, a shale-dominated subsurface, like for example in deltas. So you basically have the same lithology throughout, and therefore you can any velocity regression, you know that it is related to overpressures. It's not related to lithology variation. In Oman here, it's we cannot do that, but we do it, for example, in the Nile Delta, in the Niger Delta, in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes. And the last question it is from Muhammad. How do we incorporate the pore pressures in our static geological model?
Okay. Yeah, so I don't think in static model we include the pore pressures. I think that's more to do with the dynamic modeling. So our reservoir engineers will use the pore pressure, of course, to predict the possible recovery factors. They will use it to predict the EUR per well. They will use it to predict for example, the PTs will use it for completion design. So it's more for the dynamic performance of the reservoir and less for the static. I'm not familiar. I think maybe I'll take that back. One thing we can do, as I explained, if you see two different pore pressures. So you drill in one location and you have a certain pressure, drill in another location and you have a different pressure, then that tells you that these two bodies of sand, for example, are not in communication. So you can start, if you're thinking, is there a fault in between? That could be a good reason to include that fault in your static model. So I take that back actually. So pore pressure can be used in static modeling if you start understanding regionally how that pressure is behaving. Also compartmentalization within the same field. So actually, I see that there are lots of uses of pore pressure in static modeling as well.
Indeed, in the modeling stage, the initialization part, it is in the end of the static model, the beginning of the dynamic model. It is
yes.
So it is in the intersection between the two type of models. Yeah,
definitely.
So Mahmoud, really thank you very much for your time. GSO, on behalf of GSO, we thank you for the valuable information that you shared today. And it's amazing how we see the variety of Block 6 and the different type of pressure regimes. And I hope that it's inspire the generation to go and dig deep and get use of the Pore pressure predictions. So
thank you, Dr. Talal. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really, I was really privileged and humbled by the invitation and by talking to GSO. Again, I'm available for offline questions, so please reach out. I'm not sure if I can send out my email. If people have more interest in the field and are looking for maybe a bit more reference or have more specific questions that we're not able to answer, I'm happy to answer those.
Inshallah, we will collect all the questions and we will make sure that we forward it to you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Dr. Talal.
Thank you. Wish you a good day. And
thank you.
All members of GSO and people who are listening to us, thank you again. And we will be in touch with you, inshallah, in the near future with the 5th webinar. So stay safe and stay home. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks so much.